In this lesson, we're going to look at the government of ancient Greece. Specifically, what I want to focus in on are the purpose, structure, and function of the government of ancient Greece. Like, purpose, why did they have government? And that really connects to function, like, what did it do? So, like, functions, if it did something, that's kind of its purpose as well. And then structure, exactly how is it structured and organized? So, the first thing I want to look at is this website here, which is, you're going to have a link to this on to do some more research. But we're looking here at the city-state, and the city-state is how the ancient Greece, like, I guess, civilizations were organized. There's a lot of city-states altogether, and they all actually had the same language and pretty much the same religion. They just kind of had different gods. Like, each one had their own god that, like, followed it. And it was interesting that they all had this commonality, even though they all had different kings or leaders to start out with. And that's kind of how their government started. They all had what you call a monarchy, where they had kings or queens kind of in charge of them. Similar to Mesopotamia, where you had like an emperor or someone who was in charge of each city-state. And the difference in Greece is they didn't really fight each other that much, because the geography really kept them like apart, and they were like united because they all had the same language and religions, but they were apart because and they all referred themselves as Greek, but they all were apart because like the geography really separated with the mountains and stuff in Greece, whereas in Mesopotamia it was more flat land and easier to get across, so the different city-states interacted more. So we're going to talk about the Dark Ages in Greece and turn specifically after that. So they had villages that would band together in part for protection and in part for more organized trade. They wanted strong trading centers. Groups of villages that banded together were called city-states. They actually called these a polis, Polis. That's a Greek word like politics, policy, police. All are people that would serve the polis. Police, politics, or like political things. So that's kind of this Greek word that really has traveled all the way through today. And a polis is what the Greeks called their city-states. And really, you're thinking here, looking at like purpose and function, you can really zoom in here and say villages started to band together in part for protection and in part for more organized trade. So for protection and more trade. They wanted these strong trading centers, so they grouped together and they formed what we call a city-state. Now, how was this government structured? And then were there any other functions or purposes of this government? So there was hundreds of city-states in ancient Greece, some really small ones and some really big ones with large populations. All right, and now each city-state had its own form of government. So they actually the structure here is they all had different governments. So when you're thinking about the structure, you really want to think, okay, they each had their own form of government, and there's going to be 3 different ones. But they did all have armies, and the armies were ideally going to be for that protection piece. They're going to protect. A lot of times the Mesopotamian armies were looked to like conquer. These weren't so much protection. They were really protecting the land. The agriculture was a big part of ancient Greece, so they really wanted to protect their land. And yeah, there was some fighting, though, among it. Sometimes you even have the navy because they were close to the sea, so a navy. And it says, and each city-state certainly its own way of doing things. The states of ancient Greece had many things in common. They all spoke the same language, like I mentioned before, and they all believed the same gods. They all worshipped in the same way. So their religion and language were pretty similar, and they all thought of themselves as Greeks. But they were loyal to their own city-state. So if you ask someone in Greece, like, hey, where are you from? They would say they weren't from Greece, but because at the time it wasn't like a country. It was a collection of city-states. So they would say they were from Athens or Sparta or Corinth or Argos. The Greeks were just proud of their city-states. Sometimes the states would band together to fight outsiders, but they also fought each other. So I want to come down here and look at, like, what is a city-state? Let's move this out of the way of those lines there. So this document here is going to really hit the way that the city-states were structured, and how they eventually led to democracy. So when it's in here, like, looking at the rise of city-states. So the Greek city-states, geographic features separated them into small regions, kind of like I talked about. The form of government in Greece included colonies, was the state, which is called the polis, which is a Greek name for the city-state. They were all usually small, fewer than 20,000 people. Athens and Sparta are some of the big ones you may have already heard about. Layout. So you had the center was like called this agora. It's space for business gatherings. That's where they had a lot of trades done, political discussions maybe. some other information here about some other like cultural things they did, but we're focusing mainly on the government here. So the types of forms of government, they had monarchs and aristocrats. Each city-state was independent, used its own form of government. So they kept these political, and these kind of kept for centuries, but while some of them kept the same, others changed. So in these earlier governments, they started out as monarchies with a king or queen, and eventually they kind of transitioned. Some of them did, not all of them, but some of them transitioned to an aristocracy where upper class nobility in Greece, they were kind of born in the high family, but you had like upper class people kind of running the cities. And this eventually kind of led when you had a group of people, you're looking at an oligarchy where you had rule by the few, but this wasn't because of birth. This was mainly because people were wealthy and had land. So the rich people kind of started to take charge, and eventually some people got fed up with those rich people, and those were called tyrants, who then maybe, like, because of the increase in trade, some of the polis or city-states were able to develop pottery, cloth, wine, metalwork, and that allowed for more trade between them, and basically some people became really rich. And when these people became really rich, and they didn't like what was going on with the oligarchy, they would hire an army and get an army going, and the tyrant would basically just take over. They weren't necessarily cruel, like some people hear the word tyrant and think like someone who's mean. Some of them, they're actually good. They were helpful. They would overthrow the oligarchy, and they would kind of unite all the people together to make a new government. But tyrants didn't happen in all this. So the main forms were like the monarchs and the oligarchy, and then some of them were tyrants. Now the idea of the tyrant kind of led to the idea of citizenship, because you have the tyrant and you got to think, oh, wow, like it's this person who wasn't happy and they having money and power, so they're able to convince people to, believe in what they're saying. People learned that they could influence government, and they wanted that idea of citizenship. So Greeks created this idea of citizenship and actually started the direct democracy in Athens. In a democracy, all citizens make decisions for the government. So Athens had a direct democracy where all citizens would meet to decide on laws. Now, that's different than the U.S. The U.S. has an indirect democracy where people elect representatives. Except this direct democracy wasn't like a true direct democracy, because not all the people were invited to help here. It was called a limited democracy. That's what Athens had. Only free adult males were citizens. Women, slaves, foreigners could not take part in governments, and non-citizens could not ever become citizens. So that's kind of where the limited democracy would be in place, but that's what Greece is really famous for. It's like these starts of democratic principles where everybody kind of has a say or a voice in some fashion, and equal rights and things like that were really looked at within the Greek government. So when you're thinking about the structure, you're thinking, okay, there was kind of four main structures. There was the democracy, there was the oligarchy, and there was the monarchy, and then to an extent the tyrants. So these were the other three: monarchs, aristocrats, and tyrants. And then you have the democracy, where you're looking at the people kind of choosing, and these just are different structures where maybe you have like king or queen, a small group of rich people, and landowners, and then tyrants would be like one person who leads a rebellion and just takes over, similar to Sargon in Mesopotamia, who took over. And he kind of was, you could probably have called him a tyrant. And he eventually led and took over that whole empire there in Mesopotamia, kind of similar to what a tyrant would be in ancient Greece. So to finally come back and summarize, like the governments of ancient Greece, like your purpose and your function are really just to kind of help provide more trade, protect the people, create these armies that would help both protect and attack and fight with the other polises. Then the structure was really, some of them, they started out as monarchies, moved to oligarchies, some were run by tyrants, and finally we ended with democracy. Specifically, Athens is the most famous democracy of those Greek city-states. So they really transitioned to where the people had a lot of voice and power within their city-states.